All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's a couple minutes after 6. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Alex Tarantino. I'm PDI's Kent County Vice President and Chair of the Education Committee. I want to welcome you all to the second installment of the Women's History webinar series, which serves to highlight notable women and their contributions to Delaware's history and the built environment. Tonight's webinar is called Female Educators and Activists of Color in Delaware History, presented by Dr. Ann Boylan, Dr. Reba Ross Hollingsworth, and Dr. Abdullah Muhammad. We're very excited to have our esteemed panelists here tonight to discuss these notable women's accomplishments in education and also how their influence and engagement in their communities stretched far beyond the classroom. So before I introduce our first presenter, Dr. Boylan, just a few reminders for our attendees. You are all muted, so if you have a question, we ask that you please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. Don't worry if your question isn't answered right away. We're going to take questions after each Dr. Boylan and Dr. Hollingsworth's presentation, so feel free to type them in as you think of them, and then we'll answer them after the presentations. You can also use the chat box to get in touch with us if you have a question or you're having technical difficulties. And I want to remind everybody that as with all of our webinars, it is being recorded, so we'll have it available in a few weeks on Preservation Delaware's YouTube channel. If you want to check it out again, or for those who weren't able to make it tonight. And after the workshop, you'll see a short survey from Zoom come up. So if you have a minute to please fill that out, I encourage you to do so. It's really helpful for us to have your input. And lastly, if you aren't already a member of PDI, please consider joining and or making a donation. Your support really helps us keep events like this one free. So we'll post more info in the chat. So first up, we have Dr. Ann M. Boylan, who taught at the University of Delaware for 30 years before retiring in 2016. She is now Professor Emerita of History and Women and Gender Studies at UD. A social historian of the United States, she does research and writes on women's history, social and cultural history, voluntary associations, and religion. She is the author of scholarly articles and 4 books, most recently Votes for Delaware Women, published by the University of Delaware Press in 2021. Dr. Boylan has been the recipient of fellowships and grants from, among others, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. Through the National Votes for Women's Trail, she worked with the William G. Pomeroy Foundation to nominate, install, and dedicate 8 suffrage historic markers in Delaware. So welcome, Dr. Boylan, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be part of this program, and I thank Preservation Delaware, of course, and Alex Tarantino, but also Dr. Abdullah Muhammad for inviting me to present. And of course, Dr. Reba Ross Hollingsworth, who is indomitable and is herself a wonderful example of a woman of color who is a long-time educator and activist. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started there. Okay. There we go. So female educators and activists of color in Delaware history. Well, this would take more than the 45 minutes or so that I have to cover such an extraordinary group of people. And I'm not particularly knowledgeable about certain periods of Delaware history, but I am somewhat knowledgeable about the era of the effort to get voting rights for women, for all women in Delaware. And so what I'll be doing tonight is talking about women who were active in the campaign for women's suffrage, who were also educators, and who played a rather important role in the larger struggle for not just voting rights, but access to the polling place in Delaware. So here's my general focus. I'm going to be talking about Black women educators in Delaware who were active in the struggle for women's voting rights. So I'll be covering the time period from about 1900 into the 1920s, with a little sort of coda at the end about some of the legacies of their work. And I'll talk about sort of three themes. First of all, connections among them. That is to say, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, that people who are activists, people who accomplish things in the world, don't usually do it alone. They have their own posse, their own group of people with whom they work. And the connections among activists are often the glue that holds them together and enables them to achieve what they achieve. I'll talk about their activist commitments so we can see how they are interrelated, how voting rights as a cause is related to other kinds of causes. And then finally, toward the end, I'll get to, well, what did they think they would be able to do if they had the right to vote? How did they envision voting rights as something that they could use to cement their activist commitments? Okay, so I should start by acknowledging the pioneering work of the late historian Rosalind Terborg Penn, who wrote one of the first important studies, big book-length studies of Black women suffragists in the United States. And you see her book here, which was published in 1998, so that's quite a while ago now, almost 25 years, African-American Women in the Struggle for the Vote. She did cover a couple of Delaware suffragists, particularly Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was active in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. But it was a really pioneering effort to begin to recover the story of African-American women as activists for voting rights. As a result, and so some of the individuals that you would have heard of if you read Dr. Terborg Penn's book, and some of you probably have heard of course, and these are just some examples. Sojourner Truth, of course, who was active beginning in the pre-Civil War years. Mary Ann Shadd Cary, our own Mary Ann Shadd Cary, was born in Delaware, born in Wilmington, and whose family has recently been the recipient of a historic marker put up by the Public Archives of Delaware. The marker is on King Street near Peter Spencer Plaza, and it acknowledges the importance of the entire family, but it also mentions Mary Ann Shadd Cary's work as a suffragist, a lawyer, a journalist, a teacher, and so on. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the third person from the left, was very significant in the voting rights movement right after the Civil War. And she made a strong plea for voting rights for all women, and especially Black women, during the 1860s when those issues were being discussed. And then, of course, all the way over, we have Ida B. Wells Barnett, whose position and whose power in the movement for voting rights for women has been rather well known for a while and was particularly highlighted in a lot of activities in 2020, which was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. So these are national figures, okay? So if we look at the Delaware story and some of the figures in the Delaware story who were both educators and suffragists, then we'll zero in on the topic I'm focusing on this evening. How did I get to this? Well, I was asked to help to research and to write with the assistance of a number of local historians and archivists and librarians and students to research and write the short biographies of Delaware suffragists. And those biographies, there are now something like 68 of them, both white and Black, were published in the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. And these biographies of Black suffragists, some of them were published in the journal Delaware History. And here's the URL so that one can go to the online biographical dictionary. I'll be happy to post that in the chat so that you can follow up. And of the 68 or so that we were able to research and write about in Delaware, we found 18 Black women so far. So there are profiles of 18 Black women suffragists in Delaware, 16 from Newcastle County, 1 from Kent, and 1 from Sussex. I know there are more. I know that we can probably find more, and once we do, and we research them and write their biographies, we'll add them to the online biographical dictionary. So the most visible suffrage group in Delaware among Black suffragists was the Equal Suffrage Study Club, founded in March of 1914. And these two newspaper articles, the one on the left from the Morning News, the one on the right from the Evening Journal, give a brief description of the first meeting of the Equal Suffrage Study Club, which was held at the home of Emma Gibson Sykes. This is George J. Sykes, on East 10th Street in Wilmington. A couple of things I want you to notice about these two pieces from the newspapers. The one on the left says, Negro women to study suffrage. The one on the right says, more forthrightly, colored women want the ballot. Now, I know it's a little blurry and it's a little bit hard to see, but it's a good starting point for our understanding of the suffrage movement among Black women. What's notable is that the two articles are precisely exactly the same article. And a third version appeared in the Every Evening newspaper, because at that time Wilmington had two evening newspapers. A third version appeared there. So what that told me immediately was that no journalist went to this meeting and said, oh, what a great meeting, I think I'll write an article for the newspaper. What it tells me is that somebody at the meeting, and I'm almost 100% certain it was Alice Dunbar Nelson, wrote up the article and sent it to the papers. She was very good at that. She knew how to get publicity for her undertakings, and she often wrote the articles herself and submitted them to the three daily newspapers and also the Sunday paper, the Sunday Star. At this meeting, Alice Dunbar Nelson was elected president of the Equal Suffrage Study Club, and she remained in that position until 1920, when the 19th Amendment of the Constitution was ratified. The article, both articles, the same article, give us the names of the other people who were present, and I'll say a few things about some of these individuals in just a minute, but gives you a sense of how, as a historian, you go to find things you might not find in other kinds of archives. So who were they? Well, the first group that I'll be talking about were members of the Equal Suffrage Study Club. Most of them were born either in Delaware or in other parts of what we would call northern United States. Only one was born in the Deep South, and that was Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was born in Louisiana. But they were an educated group of women. Many had college degrees, and in later years, some of them gained advanced degrees, and I'll give you some examples as we go along. They owned property. George Sykes, Emma Gibson Sykes owned their own home, and they were surrounded on East 10th and East 11th Street by other middle-class African Americans from Wilmington, many of them teachers, but also the Redding family. Lewis Redding's father worked in the Postal Service, and of course Lewis Redding himself, who lived right near the Sykeses, eventually went and got his law degree and was admitted to the Delaware Bar in 1929. So you're talking about a kind of a middle-class enclave. You won't find it today. Those homes have been torn down except for the Redding home, which has been moved so that it can be available for study, and one hopes for tours at some point. East 10th, East 11th, going from King Street over to French and Walnut are sort of barren of the homes that were there at one time. But during this time period, this was a kind of uphill from the lower levels of the streets, the east-west streets, and a very kind of nice enclave of middle-class housing with nice gardens and all the rest. So these were middle-class, property-owning, educated women. 8 of the founders of the Equal Suffrage Study Club were educators, mostly at the Howard School, but some of them later at the DuPont Colored Schools. And I should explain here that I'm using the term the Howard School as an umbrella term for both the elementary section of the school and the high school. Howard High School is justly famous for its role in producing an educated cadre of African Americans who went out to change the world. But at the time we're talking about here, starting in the 1890s, the Howard School taught children in grades 1 through 12. It was the only 4-year high school in the entire state. of Delaware. And it had a primary department that went from grades 1 to 8. So if I talk about the Howard School, I'm talking about that larger group. And then there is Howard High School as well. There are 2 other women who were not at the initial meeting of the Suffrage Study Club, but who had connections to it. And they were from Kent and Sussex. They were also educators, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. So here are 2 of the main founders of the Equal Suffrage Study Club, Alice Dunbar Nelson, whom you see on the left there. 2 photographs, one from her youth. It was a photograph she liked very much and used it in some of her publications. And then one from her somewhat later years. She might have looked like this around 1920. And as you will see, the final home in which she lived at 1310 North French Street is now the site of a historic marker put up by the Pomeroy Foundation, and it acknowledges her work as a teacher and as a civil rights leader. And I can tell you from being over there that people who live in the building today are quite proud of their foremother, shall we say. On the right is Blanche Williams Stubbs, whom I think Dr. Hollingsworth will tell you a little bit more about. But her role was, first of all, to attend the meeting that started the Equal Suffrage Study Club. But then 2 months after that, the Equal Suffrage Study Club members marched in Wilmington's and Delaware's first big suffrage parade. It ran from the train station down where the Biden train station is now, up Market Street, up to 10th and Market. There was no Rodney Square at that time. And then there was a city county building there. They had a rally on the steps. Well, the members of the club marched with Blanche Williams Stubbs as their leader. And so she was an important figure in the Equal Suffrage Study Club and in the campaign for women's voting rights. And you will see that there is also a historic marker down there toward the bottom with my friend Carol Scott. Carol did the research for our work on Mrs. Stubbs, and the sign is directly across from her home at 827 North Tatnall. So if you ever want to take a walking tour around Wilmington and look at some of these suffrage markers, you can sign me up. I'll be happy to take a group and we can look at them all. There are 4 in downtown Wilmington. So connections among them. First of all, the Howard School. Alice Gertrude Baldwin was probably one of the oldest people in the room that day when they met at Mrs. Sykes's house. She was born in the 1860s. She came from a distinguished family. Her sister, for example, Maria Baldwin, was an educator in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the first Black principal of the Agassiz School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But Alice Baldwin came to Wilmington, to Howard in 1887, possibly recruited by Edwina Cruz, who was, of course, a towering figure among Black educators and activists. In the beginning, she taught in the primary department, but then she headed up the normal teacher training program. Now, that term may sound a little unusual to you, but normal schools were called that because they trained teachers. And so Howard High School had its own normal teacher training program. And so here you get this sort of rippling effect of Alice Baldwin's work and that of other teachers, where they train teachers and those teachers go out and they teach in Delaware schools and they provide their knowledge and their understanding of the world to their pupils and then to the next generation and the next generation on. Toward the end of her career in education, she was the principal of the Samuel Elbert School in the beginning of 1925. Alice Baldwin is also interesting because she was a roomer or a boarder in the home of Edwina Cruz for her entire time in Wilmington. She and the Latin teacher, Alice Brodnax, basically paid rent to Cruz, and they formed a little trio of similarly minded teachers and activists. And when Edwina Cruz died, she put in her will that both Baldwin and Brodnax had the right to stay in the house that they had lived in with her through their, as she put it, natural lives. Then the house could be sold, and it would be used, the proceeds used for a scholarship program at the Howard High School. Helen Wormley Anderson taught domestic science at Howard, and she taught at Howard for, as you see, 4 decades. She came from Washington, D.C., from a rather elite Black family, but she liked to tell the story of when she got the job. She rode on horseback from her home in D.C. to Wilmington, and she had a photograph in her archives of her on horseback. Caroline B. Williams taught geography at Howard, starting in the 1890s and all the way into the 1950s. She was a dedicated member of Shiloh Baptist Church. She had gotten her undergraduate degree at Westfield State College in Massachusetts, and then she eventually also got a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Pennsylvania. She taught geography. She loved the subject. And when she was fairly far along in her career in the 1930s, she and Arlene Bowser, another teacher at the school, took a trip one summer throughout the Middle East, including Egypt and parts of the Holy Land. So you can imagine how much fun it must have been for a geography teacher to make that kind of a trip. Nellie B. Nicholson Taylor taught math at Howard. She later became Howard's vice principal. And I met one time with a group of women who knew her, and they said we always called her Nellie B. She was a beloved vice principal, but she was a math teacher in the beginning. She had her bachelor's degree from Pembroke College of Brown University. She got a master's degree from University of Pennsylvania, and she did all the work for a Ph.D. except for a dissertation. So this was somebody with an extraordinary background in this top subject that she taught. Emma Gibson Sykes, I've already mentioned her. It was at her home that the Suffrage Club first met. She graduated from Howard. She came from Christiana, Delaware. Her family valued education, and so she graduated from Howard in 1903. Then she taught there for about 8 years, as you see. But the rules of the time were that if you married, you could not continue to be a teacher. That was true for both white and Black women, with very few exceptions. So she had to quit teaching, but then she taught evening school for quite a long time at Howard High School. And in her will, when she died in 1970, she left money for a scholarship fund at Howard High School. And then Fanny Hopkins Hamilton, who also attended the Howard School. She later taught dressmaking in evening classes, which was very important to the young women who were graduating from Howard High School, because they would wear their white dresses, which they made themselves with great skill. They would wear them to the graduation ceremony. Some people in the audience may remember her daughter, Kay Lorraine Hamilton, who was a noted Delaware teacher until well into the early 21st century. Her other daughter, Elizabeth, was also a teacher. So again, you see the ripple effect of the stuff that starts in the early 20th century and ripples out beyond just the years of the suffrage crusade. Here, of course, is a public archives historic marker for Howard High School. And although it mentions the school, we remind ourselves that it was a larger enterprise than simply the high school in those days. Here's a photograph from about 1930 of the teaching staff at Howard High School. If you look at the photograph, in the very center in the front, you'll see the principal, George Johnson. And then to his direct right, I hope I'm thinking right and left. Yes, I have trouble with right and left sometimes. His direct right, that is with a very elegant coat with the reveres on the collar. That's Helen Wormley Anderson. She later remarried Basil Webb. And then behind George Johnson, on his right shoulder, that's Nellie Nicholson Taylor. And then to her right is Caroline B. Williams. So it's a nice little sort of group of suffragists and educators and activists all there in that photograph. And on the right, you have a photograph of Helen Wormley Anderson Webb, who was married to George Anderson, who was also a very active political figure in Delaware. Now, the Garrett Settlement House no longer exists, but it was another nexus of activism and activity during these years. It was founded in 1912. It really opened officially in January of 1914. It was at 7th and Walnut Streets in Wilmington, and it basically was a community center for the east side of Wilmington. Blanche Williams Stubbs, you've heard her name now, you know who she is. She was the executive director in 1913 all the way through 1948. In case you're wondering, was the Stubbs School named for her? No, the Stubbs School was named for her son. Blanche Williams Stubbs and her husband, Dr. J.B. Stubbs, had 3 children, one of whom was Frederick Douglass Stubbs, they called him Douglas, who was a notable thoracic surgeon in Philadelphia, and the school was named for him in the early 1950s. She had already retired by that time, but she was present at the dedication. So the Garrett Settlement House provided meeting spaces for the Suffrage Club and for other activities that might need a meeting space. There were evening classes held there. Fanny Hopkins Hamilton taught some evening classes. They had a kindergarten. They had a well baby clinic in the early 1920s where mothers with new babies could get care. There was a Phyllis Wheatley Club for teenage girls, named after, of course, the famous revolutionary poet, and not just named after her, but teaching these girls a lesson about who are our foremothers. And when you know who Phyllis Wheatley is, you know you have a long history that you can call upon when you think about Black women in public life. It was a community center. It was a center for the community on the east side. It was the only thing like it in the city at the time because Black people could not go to other settlement houses in the city of Wilmington. The site now at 7th and Walnut is the site of St. Michael's Day Nursery, but when the settlement house closed, it was actually because they were going to build St. Matthew's Church on that site. And so St. Michael's Day Nursery incorporates part of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church as well. Now, so you have an introduction to some of these women. You have a sense of particularly their role as educators. And if you run a community center in a settlement house, you are doing quite a bit of education, as you can well imagine. So let's turn to looking at some of their activist commitments. I think practically every woman on the list of founders of the Equal Suffrage Study Club joined the Wilmington NAACP at its founding. It was founded, or at least given its charter, I should be more precise, in January of 1915. Alice Baldwin served as the branch secretary for probably 20 years or more. And she regularly reported back to the NAACP headquarters about the activities of the branch. They championed the voting rights of Black men. They worked to keep the Ku Klux Klan from having meetings in Wilmington, which they were going to get the opportunity to do so. They championed Black girls who were the victims of rape, particularly by white men. They were very, very committed to the civil rights of Black Americans, and the women who were suffragists and educators were part of that. The Federation of Colored Women's Clubs was founded in 1916, and here we again have Blanche Stubbs, the first president. There was a Delaware Federation of Women's Clubs, but it was all white. We have to remind ourselves at all times that Delaware was a segregated state. So the colored women's clubs organized themselves separately. They had a number of undertakings, the most famous of which was founding the Cruz Industrial School for Colored Girls in Marshallton. It wasn't named for Cruz at the outset, it was renamed for her in the 1930s. But because Black girls who needed the kind of support system that the school gave could not go to the white industrial school, this was something that was really an important priority for these educator activists. The Walnut Street Y, of course, founded in the 1930s. Many of these women participated in it, donated to it, and so on. the Delaware State Colored Teachers Association. They were teachers and they wanted to be able to influence the way the school system operated and try to find ways to improve conditions for their students. So they lobbied hard for improvements in school facilities, for equity in teachers' salaries and pensions, for example, because until the early 1920s, Black teachers were paid less than white teachers. And they wanted equity in facilities and curricular materials for students and teachers. Again, this is under segregation, which the 1897 state constitution required in our schools. So they are not trying to break down segregation. They want things that are separate to be truly equal. And they pressed very hard for this as part of their activism. And then, of course, they cheered when P.S. DuPont gave money from his rather considerable fund of money to build the so-called colored schools starting around 1920. And they appreciated what he had done. And as you'll see from this newspaper article, in 1924, in December of 1924, a group of educator activists wanted to show their appreciation. So they commissioned a painter named Edwin A. Harleston to do a portrait of P.S. DuPont. They then presented it to him at an event in his honor, and they gave him their thanks, which Dr. Muhammad will tell you also was part of writing the song that students would use to thank Mr. DuPont, and also letters written to Mr. DuPont and so on. And as you'll see here again, Blanche W. Stubbs is the one who found the painter. She wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois, asked him, do you have somebody who could do the painting? And we want it to be a Black man or a Black person by a colored artist, she says. So this is, again, a kind of activism to make sure that Black artists get their opportunities. Du Bois wrote back 2 days later, you'll see, and he gave the name of Edwin Harleston, who did do DuPont's portrait. Now, I think I've given you a picture of these educator activist suffragists from Newcastle County and their interconnected activities. Let me point to a couple of educators and suffragists from Kent and Sussex. First, we have Ethel Letitia Cuff. Later, she married a man named David Horton Black around 1939. You see her portrait there, which was done by her sorority sisters in Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Shout out to Delta Sigma Theta and Dr. Hollingsworth. And she's also on the Delaware Suffrage Monument in Dover, which you will see if you visit Legislative Hall, as is Blanche Stubbs, as are several other people, including Alice Dunbar Nelson. Ethel Cuff Black was a Wilmingtonian. She went to the Howard School for a few years, and then she transferred to a New Jersey school. And from there, she went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. When she was at Howard during her junior year, Delta Sigma Theta was founded. She was a founding member, and her sisters honored her throughout her life. She then joined the Deltas as they marched in the big suffrage parade in March 3rd of 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It was the biggest national suffrage parade organized by Alice Paul. And the idea was to steal some of Woodrow Wilson's thunder by having a big parade down Pennsylvania Avenue the day before he was going to be inaugurated. And one story, which I'm not sure is entirely accurate, has Woodrow Wilson arriving at Union Station, looking around and saying, where are all the people? And somebody saying, oh, they're at the suffrage parade. Ethel Cuff Black championed the education of Black children. She taught in a couple of different states before returning to Delaware to teach at Delaware State University. And she particularly championed the teaching of Black history. In 1924, she wrote an article in the magazine The Messenger, run by A. Philip Randolph. And she titled it On Race Pride. In it, she said that Black students needed to learn African history. Now, remember, this is 100 years ago, and they needed to learn African history as a way to learn race pride and to provide what she called a solution to the Negro problem. How she defined that, we would probably have to spend some time trying to figure out. But the fact remains that she's arguing for the teaching of Black history. And then she very forthrightly puts this in there. Black Americans have been so segregated, Jim Crowed, lynched, and otherwise intimidated that they have learned to be ashamed of their African blood. And that was something she wanted to counteract. Her solution? Learn history from the viewpoint of the Negro, not the viewpoint of some other race. 100 years ago. So she promoted Negro History Week, which had been founded by Carter G. Woodson in the 1920s. In the beginning it was just a week. Now it's a month and a whole year, of course. And in 1927, her theme for Negro History Week was Black women who had achieved fame in education, letters, art, and the professions. So she's quite forthright and she's quite clear about what some of her priorities are in teaching. The other person I want you to know about is Sadie Monroe Waters. As you see, she lived a very long life. She lived in Bridgeville, Delaware, when this photograph was taken. It appeared in an article by Alice Dunbar Nelson in the 1920s. She taught at the Greenwood Colored School. And she came from a family of activists. To begin with, her father, Reverend Henry Monroe, was a drummer boy with the Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Infantry Regiment in the Civil War. So you can imagine the dinner table conversations in the Monroe home when she was growing up. Her father became a minister. He had a church in Wilmington for a while and moved on to Philadelphia from there. She trained at Morgan College, now Morgan State University. She taught at the Howard School for a time in the 1890s in the primary department, in other words, the younger children. But then she moved to Bridgeville after marrying George Waters. He was a businessman. He had a store in Bridgeville. And so they moved down there, and then she taught in the quote unquote colored schools of Sussex County. In 1920, we see her in the newspapers as vice president of an African-American organization dedicated to registering Black women voters and getting out the vote. And I don't know how much you know about the suffrage effort in Delaware, but if it was difficult and if the legislature refused to ratify the 19th Amendment as they did, the toughest place to work on this issue was Sussex County. I hope I'm not offending anybody. It's just a basic historic fact. So for a Black woman to advocate for suffrage and for the right of Black women to vote and to encourage Black women to register and get out to vote in 1920 was really quite courageous. After 1920, she was a member of the Delaware State Colored Teachers Association's legislative committee. That meant that she went to Dover regularly to lobby for the things that we saw a little earlier. Equity, equity, equity in teacher salaries, in the provisions for the students, in their textbooks. You may have a nice building that was built by DuPont money, but you still need a chalkboard and chalk, and you need pencils, and you need paper, and you need textbooks, and you need everything that goes into a school. And so she was one of those who lobbied in Dover for these sort of questions of racial equity. Eventually, after George Waters died, she moved to Coatesville, Pennsylvania. I don't know what the reason why it might have been for moving, but she was quite successful in Coatesville during the 1930s. She became a school principal, and she was widely admired for her efforts in the 1930s to help feed the students in her school, because during the Depression, life was tough, and she was there, again, advocating for her kids to make sure they got what they needed, even food. So we have some examples of individuals now. We have examples of the kinds of commitments, these sort of interspersed, interlaced commitments that they shared and they worked on together. So I want to come back to a point I raised at the very beginning. What did they do with their votes? How did they use their voting rights once they had the right to vote? And Black women voted in large numbers in Delaware once the 19th Amendment had been ratified, when Tennessee ratified in August 1920. Well, first they pursued a broad program of racial and gender equity. And I think this is very clear in their advocacy for their students, and their advocacy for their schools, and in their advocacy for women teachers and for women's rights. They registered African-American women as voters. They did voter education. They showed people, this is how you register, this is what the ballot looks like, this is how you're going to fill it out, okay? They challenged voter suppression efforts. And if you think that voter suppression is a new thing on the face of the earth in the 2020 and 2022 elections, go back to Delaware in the 1920s and you will see efforts to suppress Black voters' voting rights through threats and intimidation and other activities that I can give you more information about if you'd like to ask about that issue. They joined with white suffragists to defeat a particular legislator, a guy named John E. McNabb. His nickname was Bull, and you can get a sense of what kind of personality he had from that nickname, I think. His bid for a seat in the Senate in 1920. John McNabb, Bull McNabb, served in the House in Dover. He led the charge against ratifying the 19th Amendment. He didn't just lead the charge against ratifying it. He led the charge in a very ugly, very direct, racist fashion, basically saying if women win the right to vote, then Black women in Delaware will be voting. But he did not say Black women. He didn't say African American. He didn't say colored. He used a very ugly racial slur in the House of the legislature, making his argument. So white suffragists blamed him for being anti-suffrage. Black suffragists blamed him for being a racist anti-suffragist. They worked together to turn out voters to defeat him, and he was defeated for his effort to join the Senate, to move from the House to the Senate in Dover. They lobbied for state funding, as I indicated before, for institutions serving Black Delawareans, and those included educational and healthcare facilities, particularly the Marshallton School for Colored Girls, for example, but also healthcare facilities for Black Delawareans. Black Delawareans with tuberculosis, for example, had to go to a rather fly-by-night, or at least badly funded, sanatorium for people with tuberculosis, because they couldn't go to the one that was set up for supposedly all Delawareans, but actually only whites. And in 1922, they crossed party lines. These educator activists crossed party lines to help defeat Caleb Layton, who was Delaware's member of the US House. He was a Republican. Most of them were Republicans. This is the time when the Republicans were the party of Lincoln and the party of civil rights, because he would not support a federal anti-lynching bill. And so they joined with people who were opposed to Layton, and he lost his seat in the US House. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the signing of a federal anti-lynching act took place exactly 100 years later. On March 29th, 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. And then, as I've indicated, these women taught and mentored their students so that their influence moved far out beyond them in these ripples that led out to other schools and other individuals and clubs and you name it. So let me finish by giving an example of their legacies. And there are hundreds, thousands, and I'm sure people in the audience probably can give examples as well, but I'll give one. Cora Berry Saunders was born in Maryland in 1903. She moved to Wilmington in order to attend Howard High School. And she attended Howard High School by rooming with one of the teachers, Caroline Williams. We saw Miss Williams earlier in the photograph that I showed you, the geography teacher who got to go to the Middle East. Okay, Cora Berry was living at her home and going to school at the Howard High School in 1920. She became a teacher herself. She had teaching degrees from Westchester and other places. And her students knew her as Miss Cora. One of my neighbors said, yes, Miss Cora taught me at the New London Road School, which is now the George Wilson Community Center, and also at Central Elementary School in Newark. She was a life member of the NAACP and a member of the Phi Delta Kappa teaching sorority. So you see these interconnected activisms that these educators carry on. The NAACP is a really important advocacy group, and Mrs. Saunders was part of that. And then she and Catherine Young Hazur became the first two Black women to receive master's degrees from the University of Delaware in 1950. If you know the Delaware story, you know that the university was a target of a lawsuit. It desegregated, and among the earliest students to sign up, Black students to sign up, were Cora Berry Saunders and Catherine Young Hazur. So they were pioneers, and you can imagine how Cora Berry, living in Caroline Williams's home, going to school at Howard High School, doing her homework at a table in Ms. Williams's house, how the legacy of the teaching of these Howard High School teachers, their activism, their commitments, how that infused her life and then moved on beyond her life to her students. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn the microphone back to Alex Tarantino, I believe.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Boylan. That was fascinating. So we do have a question, and I think, you sort of, you covered this, but is there anything else you'd like to add about the significance of the role that African-American women played in the suffrage movement?
Oh, yes, of course. There's a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion in 2020 about whether the suffrage movement kind of kept Black women out. Anybody who kept the Black women out were the anti-suffragists. The anti-suffragists were right, left, and center, no interest in Black women voting. So the answer has to do with depending on where you are. In Illinois, Ida B. Wells Barnett and the Alpha Suffrage Club that she headed up was very, very involved in the suffrage movement and made liaisons across the racial barrier with white women. In California, during the referendum campaign in 1911, Black women were very, very active. In New York in 1917, there was a referendum campaign. So these are state referenda before you get to the national. So depending on where you're talking about, in Florida, in Alabama, in Louisiana, it was very tough. Black women still organized. They still pushed very hard for their right to vote. In the federal amendment, trying to get the 19th Amendment of the Constitution ratified, there is no question that suffrage leaders from the National Woman's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association kept Black suffragists at arm's length. There is no question about that. But to give white suffragists some credit, when they had the opportunity to edit the wording of the 19th Amendment so that it would let the states disfranchise Black women, they said no. So it's a very mixed, very, very mixed record. But I want people to take away from this an understanding that Black women are active in the suffrage movement all across the United States, even against really difficult odds in places like Alabama and Mississippi. And they continued their activism after 1920.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, so we don't have any other questions at this point, but I want to welcome everybody, as they come to mind, please send them through in the Q&A, and we can cover any more at the end. But now I want I'll turn it over to Dr. Muhammad to introduce Dr. Hollingsworth.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I am really privileged to have this opportunity to introduce someone that I admire and have looked up to ever since I've met her. And I hope that she's looking forward to really speaking with us about her experience because she has the unique position of having lived through the period that Dr. Boylan has just shared with us for a great part. I mean, she was born in 1926 and started school in 1932. So she has seen her share of the history of African-American activism among women and others during that particular period. So I just want to introduce her by letting you know that she was born and raised in Lincoln and Milford, Delaware in 1926. She was born. She's a lifelong and dedicated educator, counselor, and community activist. She's the second oldest of 7 children. She began her life overcoming the obstacles of living in segregated communities and forced to attend DuPont College schools. Mandated segregated schools forced her to leave her family to live on her own as young as 14, to attend distant DuPont College schools like Booker T. Washington College School and Delaware State College High School for college students, both in Dover. Imagine being told that you had to move to another city to attend junior high and high school. Imagine being given only one choice of where to attend high school in the entire county because it was, at that time, the only educational institution in Kent and Sussex County that provided high school instruction beyond the 8th grade to African American students. At that time, only white students could go to the high schools. Dr. Hollingsworth was forced into that situation, but she made the best of it. She graduated at the top of her class from Delaware State College High School in 1945, and then successfully graduated from Delaware State College in 1949 with a BS degree in home economics. After becoming a home economics teacher, she was again forced to leave not only her home this time, but also the state, just to find a teaching position in South Carolina. And despite having to travel so far for work, Dr. Hollingsworth was determined to further her education and to get a teaching position in the state. Even though she received her certification in home economics in the summer of 1952 from the University of Delaware, upon her return to the school to complete her master's degree work, she was refused the degree after completing the program in 1966. This was a result of being shunned and ignored as one of only 2 Black students in the School of Home Economics graduate program at the University of Delaware, where she outshined the other students. Not to her surprise, she found that racial bigotry and discrimination were still the order of the day. Nevertheless, she was not deterred and decided to pursue and earn a master's degree in guidance and counseling from the University of Delaware in 1970 and her Ph.D. in counseling from Pacific Western University in 2001. During Dr. Hollingsworth's long and extensive career as an educator, she has served in many teaching, counseling, supervisory capacities. She has served as an overseas travel study counselor, an adjunct professor at the University of Laverne, California, Wilmington College, Newcastle, Delaware, and Delaware State University, Dover, Delaware. She was a counseling practicum supervisor for the University of Delaware, Newark, Delaware, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Illinois, and Wilmington College, Newcastle, Delaware. For many years, she served as a consultant to the Brandywine College Admissions Department and the instructor trainer for parent and teacher effectiveness training courses. Dr. Hollingsworth and her late husband were also the co-owners of Hollingsworth and Hollingsworth Consultant Services, and they specialized in pre-marriage and marriage counseling and parliamentary procedures workshops, and training sessions. How they put those two together, I'll never know. In addition to her career in education, Dr. Hollingsworth has served her community in countless ways, both as an educator, counselor, and an advocate for civil rights, and recognized and honored both in Delaware and abroad for extensive advocacy work. She has served on several boards and commissions, including her time as vice chair of the Delaware Heritage Commission, a life member of the NAACP, chair of the Education Committee of the Milford Slaughterneck branch of the NAACP, and first Black president of the Delaware School Counselors Association. I'm not finished. In addition, she has been a life member and parliamentarian of Delaware State University Alumni Association, Incorporated, a member of the Dr. Jerome Holland Statue Committee at Delaware State University, a member of the Friends of the Delaware Public Archive, a member of the Delaware Afro-American Sports Hall of Fame, and a member of the Delaware Women's Suffrage Centennial Committee. And still in 2017, the Early College High School at Delaware State University was renamed in her honor as the Dr. Reba Ross Hollingsworth Center for all of her accomplishments and legacy at that school. And still, as of 2022, Dr. Hollingsworth remains extremely active in state and local affairs, and she absolutely shows no signs of slowing down at the youthful age of 95. It is my esteemed pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Reba Ross Hollingsworth.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Muhammad, and welcome everybody. He surprised me with some of the things that he said, but you know, when you've lived for 95 years, you've done a whole lot of things that people really don't know about until they ask you. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad. I appreciate it. And also, some of you will hear from me some of the things that you've already heard from Dr. Boylan, but perhaps from a different point of view, because I personally knew some of the people that she mentioned and had experiences that she talked about as a Delawarean born, bred, christened, and wed. Have traced my family on my mother's side back beyond 1700 in the Kent County of Delaware. My dad back beyond the 1800s in Caroline County, Maryland, and Sussex County, Delaware. My maiden name is Ross, and I wanted you to know that I am also a relative of Harriet Ross Tubman. My parents told us that a long time ago, and I actually, when I did the family history, found the connection between the two families, and I'm very proud of that. So I wanted to share that with you, because Harriet Tubman was one of the persons that was mentioned as one of the persons who was very active as a woman in the state of Delaware and in the entire country. So I feel like I'm connected to somebody famous. Anyways, that's another whole story that we'll have to talk about later. I was asked to actually talk about some of the women in the state of Delaware who had contributed to the education of and the growth of education in the state of Delaware. Some of you may already know that during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and even before that, Black education for Black children in the state of Delaware was not a priority. If you look at it, actually prior to 1866, when a group of white and Black people in Delaware founded the Association of Moral Improvement and Education for Colored People, there were really only 7 elementary schools in the state of Delaware, no high schools at all for colored people in the entire state. It was actually in 1972, until that time really, there was a law on the state of Delaware books that said that Negroes only needed enough education to read, write, and count a bit. And it was Senator Margaret Rose Henry who actually got that law changed. And I always said that if that's all the education that I and my sisters and brothers needed, we didn't need to go to school at all because our parents had taught us to read and count a lot before we went to school at all. And that was so with a lot of Black children that people really didn't know. And the thing that really bothered a lot of us as Blacks is that we were accused of being ignorant and backwards and not knowing the language, but they forget that there were almost 100 languages in this continent of Africa, and most of us knew some of those a long time ago, and a lot of people didn't. And most of us actually knew a lot more than we were given credit for. And I wanted to say that because I'm not a historian, I'm just a person who's lived for a little while. Delaware history does intrigue me a bit because having lived it and experienced a lot of situations, both good and bad in the state, it's still my home. And I still try to fight to make sure that everybody is recognized as one of God's children. I was asked to look at several women because actually Delaware history has been neglected, and you've heard about how DuPont built the schools. Actually, I don't know whether people really realize, but at first he wanted to build schools for white children because the condition of the white schools at that time was deplorable as well. And the conditions that he offered to the whites were not easily accepted. And so he decided to build schools for Black students in the 1920s. So it was kind of like, well, if you don't want it, I'll give it to the Blacks and see what you like about that. Well, anyway, tonight I'm going to just talk a little bit about a few women. Alice Dunbar Nelson, Alice Ruth Moore was her maiden name, was born July 19th, 1875 in New Orleans, Louisiana, of a mixed African-American, Native American, and European American background. Most of us in the United States can say the same kinds of things if we do our ancestry check and find out exactly what the connections are. At age 17, Alice went to Straight College and graduated at that age, and then which is now called Dillard University, and graduated at 17 with a teaching degree and began teaching in the public schools in that city. She also then studied at Cornell University, Columbia University, and the University of Pennsylvania. In March 1898, she secretly married the famous poet, who became famous anyway after she married him, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and while she was teaching in New York. And she actually married 3 different times and kept the names of her first and her third husbands, which means that she is known now as Alice Dunbar Nelson. So those are her first and third husbands' names. In 1902 to 1920, Alice was the head of the English department at the Howard School, it was Howard High School by that time, in Wilmington, and also served as director of the summer sessions for colored teachers at Delaware State College. It was, at that time, State College for colored students. In 1920, Alice became the head of the Cruz Industrial School for Colored Girls, which was founded by Edwina B. Cruz, who was the first African-American principal at the Howard School, which later became Howard High School. I had the privilege of working at that school from 1950 to 1951, and it was quite an interesting school. It was more of an industrial school, a reform school for girls at that time, but that's another part of the story. Edwina Cruz served as the principal for Howard High School from 1876 to 1920. Alice Dunbar Nelson, though, prepared her students when she came to think critically and to speak in an articulate manner. She was very active in the Wilmington community as a poet, lecturer, author, editor, publisher, organizer, politician, and a cultural critic. On September 18th, 1935, at the age of 60, Alice Dunbar Nelson died of heart disease. The next person I wanted to mention is Ethel Letitia Cuff Black. You've heard that she was one of the founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, of which I was made a member in 1957. I really got to know Ethel Cuff Black very well because she taught at Delaware State College and was my mother's teacher, history teacher there. And of course, when I told her who I was, then I became one of her proteges. I had to put that into that little personal part, right? Ethel Cuff Black was born in Wilmington, as you've already heard, and attended Howard School. After graduating from the 8th grade in 1903, she enrolled in the Bordentown, New Jersey Manual Training and Industrial School for Colored Youth and graduated at the top of her class. In 1910, she enrolled at Howard University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in teaching in 1915. And it was, of course, here with she and 21 other girls were founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority in 1913, and served as the vice president of the Alpha chapter. After graduation from Howard, Ethel taught briefly in Sedalia, Missouri, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, before accepting a teaching position in 1924 at State College for Colored Students in Dover. I met Ethel Cuff Black, and actually I met 18 of the 22 founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Ethel believed that teaching Black history, as you've already heard, to Black students was a means of instilling racial pride and providing a solution for the Negro problem. She believed that African Americans had been so segregated, Jim Crowed, as you've heard, lynched and intimidated, that they were ashamed of their African blood. Some of them were, and some of them weren't, depended on what your parents taught you. But she believed that if students learned history from the viewpoint of the Negro, not the viewpoint of some other race, that they would realize that they have everything to be proud of in their African blood. In 1930, Ethel moved to New York City, purchased a home there in Queens, met and married David Horton Black. Ethel died on September 18th, 1977, at the tender age of 87 years. The next person I wanted to share a bit about is Emma Bell Gibson Sykes, who was born in Christiana, Delaware in 1885, and later moved to Wilmington and married the dentist, George Sykes. She became a teacher at the Howard School there. She was very active, as you've heard before, in local politics as a campaign volunteer for the Republican Party and served as the Register of Wills. She also worked in the women's suffrage movement and campaigned for many years to win the women's right to citizenship and vote. I can tell you that it wasn't an easy thing. The women actually got the right to vote 6 years before I was born. So I had the experience when I first voted of some of the maltreatment of Blacks in the polls. My husband and I had actually gone to the polling place where we had told to register when we moved to Wilmington. And when it came time to vote in 1948, they told us we were in the wrong precinct, sent us to another precinct. And of course, they did not have our name on the rolls there. They sent us to the headquarters, and it took us almost all day to prove that we were certainly eligible to vote and to get their certificates so that we could vote. At that time, they were using paper ballots. And when we got back to the polling place, these people handed us, or tried to hand us, a marked ballot and told us to bring the unmarked ballot out and give it to them. And of course, my mouth started working 210 1/4, and I said so much and talked so much that they put my husband and me both in the same polling booth to vote at the same time so they could hurry up and get us out of there, because I was making too much noise about being able to vote on my own, not needing anybody to tell me who to vote for and that kind of thing. But I just wanted to share that little tidbit with you, because even though I was not a member of the women's suffrage movement and getting the vote, I certainly had the experience of the effects of being Black and trying to vote in the state of Delaware. That was just one of them that I wanted to share with you. But with Emma Bell Gibson Sykes, she was very, very active with the campaign. And for many years, she acted on her principles toward the citizenship and the women's right to citizenship and voting. Along with other women, Emma Bell Gibson marched in the suffrage parades and worked to convince the male legislators to grant women the right to vote and to have a voice in local government. I'm not sure how much of it we still have because there's some things that still go on that irk me, but anyway. The next person I wanted to share with you is Alice Gertrude Baldwin. She was one of the first female principals at Howard, I'm sorry, she worked for, was hired by the first woman principal, Edwina Cruz, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, as the head of Howard Teachers Education Program. In 1912, Edwina Cruz and Alice Baldwin were the founders of the Delaware's first branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which filed civil suits against white male employers for inequality. Alice served as the group secretary for more than 10 years. The next person is Blanche Williams Stubbs, whom you've also heard about. Blanche Stubbs was the wife of Wilmington Dr. J. Bacon Stubbs, and she was also a teacher who was working for the women's suffrage movement and served as the head of the EqualSuffrage Study Club, a group of African-American women who were working toward women's right to vote. Stubbs served as the president of the City Federation of Colored Women and the director of the Thomas Garrett Settlement House for many years. The Garrett Settlement House offered classes and recreational activities for Negroes, adults, women, and children. The next person is Catherine Young Hazor. In the 1950s, of course, you've heard that she was one of the youngest principals, African-American principals in the Wilmington school system. She, along with Cora Berry Saunders, as you've heard, were the first to get their degrees from the University of Delaware. And you also heard that I attended the University of Delaware in 1952 when they still were not very welcoming to Blacks on their campus and made no bones about it. But I figured that my family and I all paid taxes, and it was so the university received taxes to help to support the university, and I was going to get something in return. On the first day that Catherine was at the University of Delaware, the provost in his address to the student body, which was composed of 700 white students and 10 African-American students, said, "Your grades will depend not only on academic acumen, but on how well you get along with other people." Now, she didn't say what those other people were, but she did say that it was an awfully tense year. And I can imagine having experienced it 2 years later. After graduating in 1951, Catherine was a teacher and a principal in various elementary schools in Delaware for more than 40 years. She also served as the director of the first preschool program, Head Start, in the Wilmington Public Schools. And the last person on the list is Reba Ross Hollingsworth, and you've already heard from Dr. Muhammad about her. Thank you very much for letting me have these few minutes to share a little bit about women, Black women, and their accomplishments in the state of Delaware. Thank you. All right, Dr.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hollingsworth. I mean, you are a treasure and an institution in and of itself. And we thank you very much for gracing us and blessing us with your appearance this evening. I would like to ask, are there any questions from anyone? Alex, do you have any questions that have come in on the chat?
I don't see any here. What I am seeing is a lot of praise from our attendees. for both presentations, and Dr. Hollingsworth of your impressive resume and accomplishments. But yeah, please, I invite everybody to, if you do have a question, you can type it in the chat, Q&A, either way works for us.
Well, let me
Here we
just
go.
pick
There's
up.
one really quick, sorry. Somebody is asking how they can connect with you, Dr. Hollingsworth.
Well, okay, by email, by telephone. I'm in the telephone directory under my husband's name. And so his name was Boylan Hollingsworth. And so we kept the phone number in the telephone directory. And my email address also has his name in it because I believed in breaking in one mother's son, and I kept the one I broke in for 69 years. And so my email address is bnhollingsworth and the number 1@yahoo.com. Thank you very much.
Let me just say that we are going to have a second part because I was supposed to deliver at this point some, important information from the study we had done on an oral history project that completed and concluded as of December of last year. And we're going to have a panel discussion inviting back, of course, Dr. Boylan and Dr. Hollingsworth. And we're going to ask all of you to send in your questions. I will have prepared questions because knowing the depth and breadth of their presentations this evening and what I know about the DuPont Color Schools, I am going to be giving them an opportunity to speak on the topic of the DuPont Color Schools and more in depth by posing these questions that really have come about based on our research and based on the oral histories that we received from a number of individuals that are up in age, and it was such a important project to get done, and that we're going to continue because these group of individuals are dying off, and we need to find out, as it has already been pointed out, that we get the history from those who lived the history. And so that's a part of it. We're looking currently at around the second week of July to have this second part of the panel discussion. But we will have a date certain out to you. I believe I was told in a couple of days. So you should be, if you attended or you signed up for this particular webinar, that you'll be getting an email to let you know when the second part to this webinar series will be aired. And as I say again, it should be around the second week in July. I want to thank Dr. Boylan. I told her ahead of time that I was really looking forward to her presentation. She didn't let me down at all. She was absolutely fantastic in her delivery. I admire so much the fact that she has this information just right on the tip at every moment. She doesn't even seem to be thinking about it at all. It just rattles off. You are to be commended. I mean, I know you worked very hard to be at that particular polished state of your delivery, but I just admire it. I admire Dr. Hollingsworth's memory because at 95, she remembers a whole lot more than I remember, and I'm a little younger than her. And I'm just looking forward to asking them pointed questions that they could just answer off the fly. And I think you'll be very, very interested for you to tune in for the second part of this series to hear them just really give answers to a number of questions that we're going to be shooting off to them in July. So with that, we're at about 7:24, a little ahead.
So we do, just really quick, we do have a question that came in.
Oh, okay.
Before we let everybody go. So the question I would say I would pose it to everyone, both Dr. Hollingsworth and Dr. Boylan. Where do you see the direction of education today? Sort of, I guess, looking into the future, maybe. Where do you sort of see it headed? Or I don't know, maybe you can speak to where you would like to see it headed?
Why don't we go in alphabetical order?
Okay, go ahead. If you want to go in alphabetical order, go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you're already speaking, go ahead, because I don't see Dr. Boylan jumping in on you.
Well, as an educator, I believe that education begins at the home, and having started my education years before most of you were born, our education actually started in the home, and our parents taught us to read and write and to appreciate. And also I was blessed to have a lot of African-American, Black history, colored history, whatever you want to call it, taught by my family. I was also blessed to have, as my second and third grade teacher, the niece of the person, Carter G. Woodson, who actually founded Black History Week. And I also got to meet him and talk with him about it. And because I, even though I'm not a history buff as such, I like history. And I know that that's the thing that on which we build our foundation. As far as I'm concerned, we need to incorporate more of our history, Black history, into the curriculum of all of our schools, because there's so much that people don't know about our accomplishments and things that we have done. Even they know about the Civil War and the slavery period, but they don't know about the fact that there were Blacks in the United States before Christopher Columbus discovered America. They don't know either how or what it was like for those slaves, those people who became their slaves from Africa, to go through the door of no return and leave their handprints on the wall, to scrape their fingernails on the wall to try to keep from getting on the boat to come to the Americas and become slaves. Most of them don't even realize that not all Africans who were at the
Door of no return?
Yeah, the door of no return, but I'm trying to think of the building itself. But anyway, at the door of no return, if a woman got pregnant, or a Black woman got pregnant while she was waiting for the ship to come over, and she got pregnant by one of the white people, white men, then she was not sent over as a slave. And I got a chance when I was in Africa to meet a lot of people, and in one country, at least there are the Africans there look like African Americans in the United States. And so we know full well that they didn't become all shades of brown by themselves. So, and I think that people really need to understand that just because we came over as slaves didn't mean that our ancestors were stupid and that we were less than. And so to understand our value, and if you go back as far enough in history, you realize that just like I have some white blood in me, most whites have some Black blood in them. And the civilization actually started on the continent of Africa. And a lot of people don't realize those things that are part of our history. And so for that reason, in order to help people understand and accept each other as the valued person that they really are, they need to know about us and not shun us and not be afraid of us.
Well, I thank you so much for that, Dr. Hollingsworth. Dr. Boylan, we have about 2 minutes. If you'd like to comment.
It's an awfully big question. My children went through the Delaware public school system during the era of DSEG. And one of the things that concerns me greatly about Delaware's current situation is what we call in my house RESEG. With the lifting of the court order back in the late 1990s. And so we have, I think, a good public school system in this state, but there are so many inequities that fall very heavily on poor people, poor children, who are disproportionately children of color. So I worry a good deal about the resources that we need in our public schools being perhaps siphoned off in ways we wouldn't like. I'm heartened by the work of Tizzy Lockman and others on trying to find some solutions to the problems that were created by what I call RESEG. And I think the committee that she and others have been working on to help find new ways to work on the public schools of Wilmington is something very admirable. So I have hope in that direction, but I think we continue to have many areas where poor children who are, as I say, disproportionately children of color do not get the benefits that their ancestors would certainly have hoped for them to get through the educational system.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Boylan, and again, Dr. Hollingsworth, and I'm going to weave that question into one of our opening questions for our next segment on the second part of this webinar series. And I am going to ask Alex if she has anything else. Otherwise, you could close us out. And again, please complete the survey, but I think Alex will talk to you about that when she comes on. Alex?
Yes, definitely. So I did want to, so there were a couple of comments that came through in the Q&A. I did put them through so everybody should be able to see, but I wanted to say them aloud. One is thanking you both for your presentations. It's wonderful to have portraits and photographs of these inspirational women. These help personalize these leaders and help relay the histories, which is 100% true. It was also super powerful to hear Dr. Hollingsworth talk about her voting experience. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's a privilege to hear your firsthand experiences. And we can't thank you enough for being willing to share with us. And then lastly, so there is some interest, Dr. Boylan, in a historic walking tour in Wilmington. So maybe we'll have to put that together. I will also be in attendance if we do that.
Okay, I have my walking shoes. I can put them on and we can get going. It takes about, you can do during lunch hour, about an hour and 15 minutes to walk to the 5 historic markers that are connected to particularly suffrage and education.
Fantastic, that's great. All right, well, I did post a link in the chat. You can also just Google Preservation Delaware. Our website will come up. You'll be able to find recordings of this webinar on there probably in the next week or so, but then also information to register for the panel discussion that Dr. Muhammad mentioned that's coming up, and also any other events that we have going on, and we've got a couple sort of in the planning stages, so please do look out for that. Otherwise, I just want to thank all of our presenters so much for your time tonight. It really was fascinating, and like I said, a privilege to learn from you all. So thank you again to everybody, and thank you to our attendees. And with that, we will see you in July.
Yes,
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.